What's up guys? In this video, I'm gonna be editing this shot. A couple weeks ago, me and my buddy Derek, we went out to a waterfall in the middle of the night. Wow, that just sounds. And we brought with us some jute twine from our local hardware store. Then we found a bamboo stick in the area and we cleverly secured it to the bamboo stick by we tied it, I mean it's rope. And then we took a handheld torch and we lit it on fire. So let's see what happens when I poke it with the Photoshop stick. Alright, now this is the shot in question, and obviously it looks very underexposed. And I did that on purpose. I wanted to preserve the highlights because this fire is very bright compared to the surrounding area. I also wanted to make sure everyone knew the majesty that is Derek's belly button. Anyway. Okay. Anyway. The only reason I'm able to do this is because the A7R III has an ungodly amount of dynamic range. Let's see what happens when I push the exposure all the way up. And holy crap, there is detail all over the place. Now obviously we're not going to do that, so let me reset. First thing I'm going to do is I am going to enable profile corrections for this particular lens. It was a Canon 24-70 lens. The version 1, because I couldn't afford the version 2. And I already had chromatic aberration removal on. I also have sharpening turned off, because sharpening in Camera Raw and Lightroom sucks. You should really do your sharpening in Photoshop. Alright, now basic adjustments. We're going to bring this up to maybe 1.85 looks good. Okay, but we did blow out some highlights, so we're going to try and recover some of that. Make sure I can still see some detail in those flames. I'm going to try and balance my white point as well with the highlights. I don't want to do this. See how you just get this gray instead of white? You're really just muting your highlights, so you never want to do this. Let's bring it back up. There we go. That's a nice smooth roll off. Something like that. This is really what you want. You want it to transition nice and smoothly from the white area down to the darker tones. Okay, so now let's see what we can recover from the shadows. I don't want to go too much. I want people to focus their eye in the middle of the image. So we're just going to bring back a little bit there. Now I hardly ever touch this clarity slider, but I see a lot of people just cranking this thing up, which to me it kind of ruins the image as a whole. I mean, it brings up all this detail here, but I don't want everybody looking everywhere. I want them to look at the important bits. So I don't really touch clarity until I start to get into my local adjustments here. So let's look at it before and after. That is massively improved. Alright, well, speaking of local adjustments, let's go ahead and start with our radio filter. And I think I want to bring the waterfall out a little. Alright, I got these weird settings coming over from the last edit I did, so let's reset that. And I'm going to start with exposure. Then match the darker tones with the surrounding area with my black point, something like that. And I think I'll add a little bit of clarity. Okay. Maybe a little bit of warmth, because that was lit by the moon up here, whereas everything else is lit by the very orange fire, so this is a lot cooler. In fact, let me go back to my basic adjustments and bring my color temperature down. I want to see if I can get some of those green tones. Yes, good. See how all of this is now actually green? You still got the orange, but now we have some other colors that are being introduced when we bring that color temperature down. Alright, back to our radio adjustments. So, waterfall looks great. Now let's see if we can bring out some detail in these leaves here, because they're reflecting the light nicely. Create a filter about that size around this area. It took over these settings, so I'm just going to start from here because it's a similar adjustment. So starting with this, I'll just increase my exposure just a tad. In fact, I think that's good. If you don't need to adjust anything else, I don't see why you should. Just creates more work. See if we can bring some of this out as well. This is a little too bright. I'm going to bring the exposure down just a bit. There we go. Now let's see on the other side of the frame. Ooh, look at all those details. Quite like that. Okay, you know what? I think that's great. Whatever settings I had here worked perfectly there, so let's just leave it at that. Let's see. Do these rocks need anything? Obviously that's way too bright, so we're gonna tone this down. But I think that did help a little bit. Pretty minor adjustment, just 0.25. Alright, I think it's time to crop this down to a standard 8x10. So we're gonna include this beautiful tree along with Derek, and we're gonna put this fire right on the left bottom third. That is great. Alright, enter. Now, I'm gonna zoom out just a tad because I wanna create a vignette, because I want people to focus just in this little area and let these highlights in the trees and the rocks kind of frame Derek a little bit. So let's go ahead and choose the gradient filter. So starting with this corner, I'm going to drag in here. Once again, we got these settings that copied over from before, so let's reset that. And first thing I want to do is reduce my contrast and also reduce the clarity. Anytime you reduce these, you draw your eye away from that area. So you increase clarity, increase contrast, typically your eye is drawn there. You do the opposite, then your eyes start to look elsewhere. So decrease contrast, decrease clarity, and also I'm going to decrease exposure as well. Something around there. That looks great. The other thing I like to do is reduce the color temperature, so it adds a little bit of color contrast. You get a little bit of blue tones here, and this really pops with the orange, since they're opposing colors. So let's go ahead and add another gradient down in this corner. Now we'll do the same thing on the top left. A little bit smaller of an adjustment because I don't want to impose on these nice plants here next to the waterfall. But I do want to decrease the exposure just a tad. And then lastly, bottom left corner, bring this in a little. I think it's a little too dark, so let me bring that back up just a tad. And there you go. Let's go back to our zoom tool so we can see this. All right, this looks pretty great. I think I do want to crop in just a little bit more from the left. I feel like I got a little bit too much negative space right around here. So let's punch in just a tad, bring it up a little. And that feels a lot better. All right, all of that done in Adobe Camera Raw. If you guys have Lightroom, you would have been able to do exactly the same thing. Now we're gonna add my little color grade, which is just my little personal look to the photo. So if you guys have Photoshop and you wanna follow along, let's go ahead and open this guy. I do use a couple plugins. I use the Nik Collection as well as Lumenzia. Lumenzia is 40 bucks, but Nik Collection's free. So if you guys wanna pick that up, just Google it. So here we are in Photoshop. Just a little side note, if you guys do use Photoshop 2018, you have to use this selective tool for the Nik Collection. You have to go to File, Automate, and Selective Tool. Otherwise, if you go to Filter and then Nik Collection and choose something from here, it's just gonna crash. So let's launch ColorFX Pro from here right off the bat. And I have assembled some of my favorite filters here, so I'm just gonna click on that and they're gonna populate in the right side. These are all turned off. If you guys wanna take a screenshot of this, these are my favorite filters, but I don't use all of them all the time. Usually I'm just using a couple. So in this case, I think I just want to use the color cast correction from my Pro Contrast filter. So if I open up Pro Contrast, there's this correct color cast. And I think I want to dial that up to maybe 40%. That looks good. Brings out a little bit more greens in here. Now that I'm looking at the greens, maybe I want to accent this foliage, which is this filter here. So let's click on that guy. And I'm going to crank this up to 30, maybe 40%. So if I turn this off and I turn it back on, you can see how it added a little bit of contrast and attention to these leaves and the brush in this area. There's this method option here, and I usually use number 2, which is a middle ground between yellow and green. So I think actually in this case, I do want to use the green. because there's so much yellow already. I kind of want to make sure that there's a little bit of other colors in the scene. Now I'm going to go down to contrast only, which is what I think kind of creates my personal look. So what I do is I reduce the regular contrast to about 10%, minus 10%, excuse me. And then I add soft contrast about 30%. Then I increase the brightness to about 3 or 4. And what that does is it reduces your attention on the finer details and really accents the strong composition of this image. I'm a firm believer in the image should be strong as a whole, whereas the finer details are just secondary. Then what I'll do is I'll have a tonal contrast adjustment above my contrast only. And I'll use this to either add contrast to the midtones or to the shadows, depending on what part of the image I want to bring out. In this image, I think the midtones are a little bit more important than the shadows. I don't need people looking into the corners here. Because like I said earlier, if you add contrast somewhere, it's going to draw your eye there. So I don't want to add contrast to the shadows because it's just going to make more detail in these corners, which I don't think is very important. So let's crank up the midtones a little. Pretty subtle difference, but I did get some detail back in this area. And last, I think I'll add this skylight filter to about 10%. And what that does is it just adds a little bit of warmth to the midtones and a little bit of magenta to the highlights. So I'm gonna hit OK here. Close out this pane, and now I have my Color Efex Pro 4 layer. Now I don't like what it did to the highlights of the flame because I did lose a lot of that detail. So I think what I want to do is I want to create a mask and gently brush out this area to bring some of the detail back in the flames. I'm going to use a pretty low opacity, maybe 10%, and then 10% flow as well. So let's paint this out using black ink. I think that worked pretty well. If I disable this by hitting Shift and clicking on the mask, it will disable the mask, and see, that's what we had after, kind of washed out and mushy. And if we turn it back on, now we get our detail back in those flames. So there we go. Now I think I'm going to use Lumenzia a bit. I think the darker to midtones are still a little bit too dark, so I'm going to go over here to my Lumenzia pane. I got DM2 and DM1. Let's see which one creates a nice mask for me. Let's check out DM2. I think DM2 gives me a little bit more of the selection that I want, so I'm going to create a curves layer, and it's going to apply this to the mask of the curves layer. So now I have these curve adjustments, and if I option click on the mask, it'll show me what areas I'm affecting. All of this black here is going to be untouched, but everywhere you see gray is going to be at least somewhat affected. So let's click on the layer again, and we're going to bow this upwards. Now I think I'm going to add this glowy effect I learned a couple years ago. So in order to do that, I am going to stamp all visible layers by hitting Command, Option, Shift, E. So that's going to create a brand new layer here with all the visible layers combined. And I'm going to go up to Filters, Blur, Gaussian Blur. We're going to choose a 45 pixel radius, hit OK. And I'm going to name this layer Overlay. And I'm going to change the blend mode to Overlay. Then I'm going to duplicate that overlay layer and change that name to Screen. And then I'm going to change the blend mode to Screen as well. So if I didn't do anything else, you have this crazy glowing effect applied to the entire image, which I think looks a little bit ridiculous. So rather than leave it like that, I'm going to take the overlay and screen layers, group them together by shift clicking them and hitting Command G. And I'm going to change the opacity to 20%. And I'm also going to create a mask. Then I'm going to invert that mask by hitting Command I so that everything from the bottom layers show through. And I'm just going to paint in the glowing effect to the parts of the image that I want, which I think is this ring of leaves and brush here, as well as the waterfall. So I got my brush here with white paint, opacity 20%, flow 20%, and let's get to painting. All right, there we go. I got a lot of glowing from the flames here already, so I didn't really add too much in that area, but I added a little bit here around the ring of the leaves, and then just a tad on the waterfall here. So here's your before and after. Just a little subtle glow from these leaves and stuff. Now the last thing I think I'll add is a little vignette, and Lumenzia makes it easy. There's a little button here that's called vignette, so I'm just going to click on that, and it's going to automatically apply a vignette layer with an opacity of 30%. I'm just going to change that to 20%, and I think that's good. And I think I'm done. I am just planning to post this to Instagram, so I'm not going to worry about sharpening or noise reduction or anything like that, because this is a 42 megapixel image, so we got plenty enough data already, and once I reduce the size, none of that's going to matter. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to merge all visible layers by hitting Command-Shift-E. Then we're going to go up to Image, Image Size. We're going to make sure that our ratio thing is locked here, and we're going to change the width to 1080. It's going to automatically change the height to 350, which is the maximum resolution for Instagram. So let's hit OK. And now that I have my final resolution, I can add sharpening. So we're going to duplicate this background layer. We're going to go to Filters, Other, High Pass. I'm going to leave it at 1.2 radius and hit OK. Then I'm going to change the blend mode to hard light. Now we have this sharpening effect, but I think it's a little too strong. I might dial it back down to 70%. And I think that looks great. Now to export. We're going to go to File, Export As, and we're going to choose JPEG. And we're going to leave all of this the same, but make sure you convert to sRGB here. Make sure you have this checked. Instagram, Facebook, and most web browsers all use sRGB, and if you export it in a different color profile, it's probably not going to turn out how you think. So now we're going to hit Export All. We're going to name this Derek's Belly Button. Save. And now we have our final image here. Ta-da! So that is a full edit from beginning to end. I didn't leave anything out. So I hope you guys learned something. If you guys still have questions or you guys want to see me edit something else, definitely hit me up in the comments section below. And if you guys enjoyed this video and you want to see more like it, please subscribe. But until next time, my name is Kaviko with Ninth Ave Studio, and I'll see you guys in the next edit. Shoots!